Thank you for coming. I'm Patrick Dean, I'm the principal, and really pleased to be here to have a conversation with you this afternoon. Come forward if you like, and sorry about the booming voice in here. The only reason I really need to be mic'd is because we're videoing this thing, and better done so you can hear me than not. But the intention here is just to have an informal conversation with you about the university, and don't worry about the camera also. The only reason we film these sessions is so that I have a record, and once I get to the end of the series of meetings, I'm going to go over the notes and the videos and everything, just so that I don't miss anything, because these have been discussions they range quite widely across many issues and topics. So not to worry about that. It won't be used against you if you say anything. The whole point is to be frank and open in this conversation. So before I actually talk a little bit about my intentions in the conversation, I will just say there are many other ways in which you can make your voice heard on the subject of the future of the university. There's on the principal's website, there's a place where you can feed into the conversation if you prefer to contribute that way. You can come and see me personally if you want to. There are all kinds of ways. You can come to other events of this sort. So important thing is that everybody should have an opportunity to be part of the conversation. And this is going to go on into the spring, and then over the summer I will try to distill what I've heard and try to lay out some directions for the university that make sense and that will get us all excited. That's the intention. So if I could, and for the most part, it's you I want to hear from today. It's not for me to talk to you. I can give you some ideas about how I'm thinking about the university as it evolves. But the intention here is really to engage me in a conversation with you so that I learn about what people are thinking would be great in the university. We're at an interesting point in the evolution of Queen's. So we've just come to the end of a 10-year period of consolidating the finances of the university, trying to understand how we make the work of the university sustainable. I think many of you are aware that the funding of universities in this province is very challenging. There's been no significant increase to the operating grant on a per-student basis in this province for several decades. The operating grant isn't indexed to inflation, and inflation in these institutions runs at somewhere between 4% and 5%. So every year, the costs are higher, and the money that comes in to help deliver the education and facilitate the research that we do here, the claims on the money increase, and yet the money is less and less able to sustain it. So we've had 10 years of working very hard in the university under Principal Wolf to consolidate the finances of the university, and that has been very effectively done. We've also come to the end of our most recent strategic planning process. So the strategic framework which governs doesn't exactly govern, guides the direction of decision-making in the university stretched from 2014 to 2019. So this summer it expired. So there's a time to think differently, to think about what we want to do in the university. And at the same time, the province, as many of you will know, is changing its approach to higher education. They've rethought the extent to which they believe students should contribute to their education. So there was the 10% reduction in tuition. Not an unwelcome thing, because student tuition in this province is very high. However, it had an impact on the operations of universities. But the most significant thing is they've shifted funding for universities onto a different basis. They're now proposing over the next 5 to 8 years to fund the universities on the basis of outcomes. So, for example, the employment rate of our grads will be assessed, and the expectation will be there will need to be an improvement every year in the employment rate of graduating students in order for the government revenues to flow to support the work of the university. I actually welcome that, because these are all good things. There are 10 measures that the province is interested in, and they're all good. It matters that our students should graduate, it matters that the students should do well and find good employment, and so on. The problem with this new approach is that the measures of success are not all the measures of success in a university, they're just some. And so the one possible effect of the new world we're heading into with this is that universities will begin to direct all their activities in a certain way to satisfy those outcomes without recognizing that there's a bigger mandate. One of the biggest things is universities exist to serve society, not just in a narrow way. They exist not just to feed the economy. They exist to create a good society, a just society, to foster inclusion, and to help us create a society that we'd all want to live in. I don't see that in any of the metrics, by the way, that the province has, and that is the problem. So the reason for my holding these conversation sessions is that I want to talk about the bigger goals of the university. I think universities shouldn't just be places in which predictable things happen. Students come in, they go through a series of rituals, they're graduated, and we don't pause to talk about what kind of citizens they are, what their impact on society is going to be, what overall we want this university to do to justify its existence. That is really the point. What I want to talk about in these conversations is why we're here, what we see our mission to be. Do you agree it's about contributing to a just and a prosperous society, not only in Canada, but more broadly in the world? If so, what should our activities look like? What should our operations look like? How should we be educating students? I mean, the classic thing, if we actually believe one function of the university is to make the world a better place through producing a certain kind of global citizenship, do our curriculum decisions reflect that? Do our approaches in the classroom reflect that? Do students, when they leave, feel they've had an experience that has cultivated that in them? You know, these are the thoughts. That in general is what I'm trying to talk to people about. What are we here for? Basically, what do you want from your university? That's the question I want to ask. Are you proud of it? And if so, what are you proud of? I asked University Council recently, this is the body that exists sort of between the Board of Governors and the Senate. There's the University Council, which is mostly it is all alumni of the university, and they have the constitution is some very specific tasks they have to do. And I had one of these conversations with them recently, and I did ask, what are we proud of? You know, there's a lot about this university that people enjoy, but you know, our pride should not be a tautological thing. That, you know, we got into Queen's, therefore we're proud to be here. Therefore, the whole thing is about pride. Pride in the tricolour, pride in the oil fire, etc. That's fine. We need to take pleasure in those things. But in the end, are we a great world university? And if we're not, what should we be doing to enhance our standing? What do we want to be proud of? So there's the general question to you. So I'll give you an idea. So in these conversations, we've covered a lot of ground. There's a lot of talk in the university at the moment about our research standing. We are a major Canadian research institution, yet we do not rank in the top 100 in the world in terms of our research. Is that a problem? Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's a result of something we have no control over, but let's talk about that. We are here in the city of Kingston. What is our relationship to the city of Kingston? Do we see our mission as actively seeking to improve the quality of life in this community? Or are we here just because that's where we historically happen to find ourselves, and that relationship is not fundamental to our sense of mission? These are the kinds of questions. And then the obvious ones. What should a Queen's education look like? How should it equip you? What kind of future do we envision for our grads? So that's to give you a sense of where we're going. So now I want to hear from you. Thoughts, observations, any kinds of suggestions for direction. You can be as blunt as you like. You can be as bold as you like. My observation, and I'll just say this, is that we're not bold enough. I think it's because we've spent some years putting our house in order. I think we have forgotten what it takes to imagine a bold future for the institution. So be bold. Hey, go ahead.
Hi, my name's David. I want to ask about financial accessibility. And I kind of want to preface this, just when the OSAP cuts came out last year, I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. I believe there were stats that came out that said they kind of ranked the number of students at each institution who were affected by the cuts. I believe it was in a CBC article. And I believe that Queen's was the last university, or the university with the lowest amount of people affected by the OSAP cuts. And that number, it's possible I'm wrong on that, but I think there is a popular impression that is pretty well reinforced that students at the school are more wealthy or affluent than the average students at universities across Ontario and across Canada. And I don't think that's necessarily always because of a higher tuition, for example. And I think when we talk about what kind of university we want to have and what kind of graduates we want to produce, we all benefit from having a diversity of lived experiences in the classroom, and that certainly comes from a number of factors, but socioeconomic background is certainly one of them. And so I want to ask you how we can improve diversity at the school, especially with regard to socioeconomic background, but in all measures, and with regards to financial accessibility. I mean, I want to recognize the great work that's been done by the university to improve financial accessibility and financial aid, but maybe how we can outreach to communities that don't necessarily think of Queen's as their first choice, and how we can improve the university in that respect.
Thanks, David. Really great questions. I can't remember that Globe article, and I can't say for sure whether we were the least affected. I will say we were significantly affected. So there were students in some programs who had been eligible for OSAP, who suddenly found themselves completely ineligible. And in fact, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, students in rehab in particular, fields like that, were very powerfully affected. And then students often saw a significant drop in the amount for which they were eligible to apply. So yeah, undoubtedly, there were very significant impacts, which of course have not been frankly discussed by government. But so we do have a problem, even though it may be true that overall our student population is somewhat less dependent on OSAP than you would find at other institutions. So I'll give you my observation, having come back to Queen's after 9 years away. It feels a much more diverse place to me than it did then, back in 2005 to 2010. And I know there's been very, very significant work done to move things along. These things move really slowly, so I'm not saying that I think we're anywhere near where we need to be on the issue of diversity in the student body, but we're at least on the right trajectory. It may be that we've dealt with the easy stuff and the hard stuff is still ahead of us. On the business of this is the socioeconomic background of our students. So what I remember from 10 years ago was that we drew our students from actually a limited number of schools in a limited number of areas, mostly around Toronto. And then there was a significant part of the student body came from places like Calgary and BC and so on. I believe now the range of schools and therefore kind of postal codes from which our students come is quite a bit more diverse than it was. But there again, one of our biggest problems is the self-selecting nature of the student body here. So Queen's is a place of dynasties. So we have students here whose parents came and whose parents' parents came and so on. So there is a significant proportion of the student body that is sort of dynastically linked to Queen's. And it's in the nature of these things that the more generations of post-secondary education you go through, the more advantageous your socioeconomic position. So that portion of the population is relatively affluent. And there are students here who are not affluent. There are students here who struggle. I think we could get our hands on some of the data to give you a sense of the changing ratio. But to your point, what can the university do, and will the university take action to increase its diversity? Absolutely, we have to. I think we've only started down the road of more effective inclusiveness on all fronts, racial, ethnic diversity, but socioeconomic as well. I think there are many things. I'd say about this, what I'd say about the profile of the international student body here. If you want to make change, you've actually got to actively intervene. You've got to do your recruiting in particular places. And in some cases, you have to put in place particular programs to ensure that students from a particular kind of background can make it into Queen's. Students who are likely to succeed here can make it in here, who might have been disadvantaged from various other points of view. So, if I could take your question and then link it to the big question I was asking, what's the future of this place? We have to succeed on the diversification of the community of Queens. We have to do that. People don't know this, but when this institution opened, it was intended to be a university for those who were struggling. It was never, at its founding, an institution for the affluent. And it's very interesting, over a period of 178 years, an institution can occupy the diametrically opposite place in the landscape of higher education. And for the good of the education here, we have to dismantle some of that. Really open to suggestions on how to do that. But I think it is just a practical thing. You have to get out and you have to actively recruit. The reason I do the parallel with international students is that one way of approaching this is you just accept the students will come from those areas where students are most mobile. But for those students to be mobile, they've got to be relatively affluent. How many students from sub-Saharan Africa do we have at Queen's that do not come from a relatively well-to-do background? Very, very few, for all kinds of obvious reasons, I would guess. So thanks for making that point, because I think that's intrinsic to any kind of admirable vision we want to have for the place in the future. Yeah, please.
Hi, we spoke a couple months ago. Yeah. I'm Robert. I loved your points about what does a good education look like. We're part of outdoor and experiential education. So just a random thought in response to what you said. Okay, what do we want the experience of our students to include at the university? Some of our projects in OEE are positions of added responsibility, and that can be whatever we want, but we have to be contributing to our community. So when you talked about, hey, what does Queen's mean to Kingston? How about every student who graduates from Queen's undergrad has to be, maybe it can be individual, it can be part of a group. They've worked together. It doesn't matter if you're in quantum physics, whatever. You've worked together to see a problem in the community of Kingston and actually attempt to take a step to solving that. Along those lines, environmental as well. We all know one of the biggest global crises we have. And it doesn't have to be, and it won't be about solving climate change. It will be, hey, what's a local issue? How's Lake Ontario doing? How is the wetland doing? Again, create a group, and it's going to be cross-curricular, and it's going to be messy, and this is not how our streamed faculties work. But it's like I graduated with the Masters of Applied Science, and I did no application pretty much. So just getting to that, hey, what does a good education look like? Serving your community and serving the environment, I think those are two huge points that we need to address.
Thanks, Robert. Great points. Yeah, I mean, if we're not in service, it's hard to know how we justify ourselves, right? I find we're at a really exciting moment in thinking about education, particularly in the universities. So there's one way of talking about experiential learning, which has become kind of bureaucratized and government like it. It's a kind of a tagline that's much spoken about. But if you put that to one side, the idea of learning that occurs through experience on site, solving a problem, working with others to solve the problem, with the benefit of input and direction from professors and other experts in the area, to me, pedagogically, that is such an exciting thing. So there's a reason to embrace that to a degree far more considerable than the government is even imagining at this point. It's also the most effective way in which the university can affect social and other kinds of change, environmental change, and so on. In the US, I often look at those universities in the US that actually transform the communities in which they're located. I'm thinking of Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh, for example, places in a shambles, mass unemployment and so on, and you have a university step in to lift a society, a whole community. It's difficult to do in the Canadian context because those US schools have often done it with big endowments and so on. Or it was kind of a real estate play to advance urban renewal. But what we have that really matters is people and talent and the expertise and the determination that students bring to address some of these issues. So if you take that and unleash it on global and regional problems, this can be fabulous and exciting and transform society at large. It takes getting over some sacred cows, if I could say that. I mean, there's still the assumption that the learning that really matters is what occurs in the classroom. It may no longer be the overwhelming majority view in the academy, but it's still there. So people are conservative about where they award or accord credit, degree credit to students. We need to be adventurous about that. We need to say, some kind of environmental work is meritorious. It does deserve to be recognized as part of your program of study. And that solves a whole lot of other problems too. It addresses the environmental problems. It addresses some of the resource problems in the university, thinking about different ways of supporting students in their learning. I'm very excited about that idea, and I hope the university will find it in itself to really embrace the notion of I even prefer to talk about service learning rather than experiential learning, because service learning is really about that altruistic commitment to addressing a problem. I was at a meeting earlier today, and I described one of the most exciting classrooms I've been in the last decade. It was about 3 years ago. I was at a community center in the east end of Hamilton, a very problematic area. And I was invited to come and sit in on a class being taught by a professor from the School of Nursing. And she had a class which consisted of 2 nursing students, a couple of students from rehab, someone from social work, someone from arts and science. May have been a theoretical physicist there, who knows. It was a broad range of students. And they were meeting with a committee, a neighborhood committee, which was having to address the problems that a number of the kids were being injured on the road, trying to cross to get to school and all this. They had a real problem that came with this being a socioeconomically depressed area. And the course was about entering into a dialogue with the community, those neighbors, and identifying solutions that would have a sociological dimension, a medical dimension, a rehab dimension, and so on, a philosophical dimension. And then the students would be mobilized to take this to City Hall, and City Hall would fund solutions proposed by the students with the support of the neighborhood community. That, to me, is just a fabulous model of learning that, fires up the students with a sense of the relevance and effectiveness of what they're doing. And it actually makes them excellent partners with the community. So it's a diametrical opposite of the university dispensing wisdom with regard to social and other kinds of problems. So I hope that's a useful response, Robert. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Matt. So I wanted to acknowledge the Human Rights and Equity Office on campus is doing tremendous work and making great strides, especially within the last year, 2 years. But I also wanted to address a lot of student equity groups on campus as well, do amazing work. And I know a lot of those groups have expressed concern that their work doesn't get to the university level. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on opportunities for collaboration between the university's Human Rights and Equity Office and student equity groups on campus.
Great question. So in a way, it's a bit of a surprising observation because, I've been at a number of Canadian universities, and I've never been at a place at which students had more of a role in setting the agenda for the university than is the case at Queen's. So here you're pointing to an area in which, clearly there is a need to bring the students together with the administrative structures of the university to address the bigger issue. All I can say is I think it's absolutely what should occur. And if it's not occurring, that is an indication of some other kind of dysfunctionality. I mean, there needs to be an open dialogue between students who are working on an issue and the university people who are working on an issue. We have the same goal in mind. And it would be much more effective if there were active collaboration. So absolutely, it's good. And I can think of all kinds of ways. I mean, if you look at Queen's, you'd say we have students in every area of governance. David knows this well. David's part of the structure. And the AMS is active in setting the agenda for the university, and the rector is the third highest office holder in the university. So students are in positions of influence. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that that influence is being felt or often appreciated. That you raise it in connection with diversity and equity is really important, because what I've always said about this, and this is no great insight, but it is the truth, the responsibility for transforming this into an institution that is broadly inclusive and welcomes all people is everybody's. Stephanie Simpson can only do so much in her office. And every administrator in the university can only do so much. I can pontificate about the subject all I like. If the average faculty member in the Department of Mathematics doesn't care, there's the problem. If in the residences there are groups of students who don't see that as a critical issue, there is the problem. So everybody has to own that issue. And if everybody owns the issue, they'd better be talking to each other, I think. So good point. I hope that goes some way to satisfying. I mean, I'm not giving you an explanation of how it should happen, but I totally agree it should. Please, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Mary. Donna? Good, okay, thank you. My name is Mary, and I'm an outdoor ed student, as well, as Robert mentioned. And I'm actually the outdoor and experiential education rep for the Education Student Society. And I just wanted to talk about the environmental education concentration here for Queen's. Unfortunately, this year, the environmental education concentration isn't running. So 53 of our students chose this concentration, and they may have come to Queen's. In some instances, they did come to Queen's intending to be part of that concentration. And so now they have to be part of one that maybe they weren't as interested in. Beyond this, not only is the concentration not running, Queen's University teacher candidates are given only 12 hours of environmental education in our program, and it happens in the second summer of our program, despite environmental ed being woven throughout all aspects of the Ontario curriculum. I would argue that that's not equitable, given that everything else we learn at Queen's really hinders on the health of our planet, and that environmental ed should be a foundation of teacher education here at Queen's. In addition, choosing to not run the program that focuses on training teachers in environmental ed sends the message that it's not a priority at Queen's, and that in a warming world where climate change is an everyday reality that we face, we're electing to remove environmental education from the place of importance that I think it deserves and demands. Regardless of how this happened and how we failed the teacher candidates this year, we ask that going forward, at the very least, we bring back that concentration and have it be reinstated and made a guaranteed offering every single year. No matter if this was a scheduling or a staffing issue, however it happened, the teacher candidates at Queen's here are happy and willing to work with administration in any way that we can to find solutions so that it doesn't get omitted again in the future. And in my opinion, in an ideal and equitable world, a full course on environmental ed would be a requirement for teacher education, as we are the generation that needs to address climate change head on. And so we kindly request the tools to do so.
Thanks. So you speculated on the reasons, and I'm sure those are, a combination of those other considerations. And these things almost always boil down to resource issues. So I'll confer with the Dean on the reasons for this, and because I'm obviously very sympathetic to the importance of the issue, and I mean the argument you make about how central it needs to be to education across the board is critically important. I mean, I would say, I take the view that there are certain issues that all students across the university need to be exposed to. And environmental issues and climate change, that's one critical. We don't have this, right? So we don't have a series of, we don't even do this for the residential schools, right? I mean, we have not yet discharged that obligation to make sure that every student has a certain minimal acquaintance with a particular issue. And so I would not only support your view of what it means for a teacher, but I would take the much broader view that when we're thinking about what undergrads leave this institution with, some kind of deliberate education in environmental and climate change questions is one of those things. Reconciliation is another. Then there are a number of issues that I think we're not serving students well when we don't address them. So I definitely hear your concern. I'm quite sure that whatever decision was made would not have been made lightly to not offer the course at this stage. But I hear the request, and I'll talk to the Dean about it. Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Valerie. I'm also a teaching candidate here, and I'm really excited to hear you talking about how important it is for students, regardless of what program they're in, to learn about the environment. And something, I did my master's here. I did my undergrad somewhere else, but I did my master's here. I'm doing Teachers College here, and I'm quick to talk about how much Kingston's become my home and how much I love it here, partially because of the community. I feel like as a grad student, I found a like-minded group. I was in the Faculty of Geography, and now here at Teachers College in the Outdoor Ed program, I've also found a really great community. And all that said, though, I think what would make Queens an even better place is if all those students kind of felt grounded in Kingston. And something that might help with that is if we had some sort of classroom environment or space on campus, especially here in West Campus where we're training teachers, where we are taught outside, especially on campus here now, the consecutive students, the people who start in May, we have 2 summers where we can take advantage of the lovely Kingston weather and all the green spaces around us that maybe we could taught outside, rather than the numerous times we're in this auditorium and we have speakers come and talk to us saying, I know you're all sitting here, this isn't how we should be taught, I'm so sorry, I have to do it this way. Why do we have to do it that way? Why can't we model what we say is the leading way to teach, one of the many great strategies of teaching? Why can't we be a model for that? Why can't we be on the edge of doing it right rather than saying, I know the research says we're not supposed to do it this way, but here we are. What's the big, I know that it's tough to make a big machine like Queen's move. There are a lot of logistics of how do you do it, liability, there's lots of reasons that could prevent things from happening. But even just starting small, we had classes of about 100 people who we would spend 4 hours a day in a classroom, sitting at a table when we had a beautiful sunny day outside with lots of space we could have been enjoying and having those so they were meaningful group discussions, but why does it have to be indoors? Why can't they be grounded in a sense of Kingston in place and using nature as our classroom? Especially with climate change, one of the reasons they've pointed to is that there's a lack of connection to outdoors, and simple things can go a long way, and I think it would keep Queens the leader, especially here in the Fac of Ed where we're teaching teachers, but also in other educational contexts across the university.
Great question. Well, to answer your question, why can't it be done? I have no idea why it can't be done. In fact, what I would say, you're the teachers. Everybody knows that when you teach within an institutional context, often you're battling the effect of the institution, right? I've said this in a number of sessions. I often think as educators, we're always trying to compensate for the machine within which we are a part. And the machine is what says, it's much easier to schedule it in here, right? Even though it's about the outdoors, and even though common sense and every reasonable thought says go outside and do it, there are always those kinds of administrative institutional reasons which are not intrinsic to the educational purpose. They, in fact, detract from the optimal educational outcome. So we ought to be thinking, and I say this not just with regard to these particular courses, but I say this more generally, that we need to be very thoughtful in the university about the way in which administrative convenience or the necessities of the institutional structure and its operations actually impedes what we're trying to do. This gets to the question of what kind of people you're graduating at the end. If you have educated a contingent of outdoor educators in an indoor setting, what is the likelihood that that will translate into benefits in the school system? Right? So the same is true if you've trained nurses exclusively in lecture theatres, looking at videos and learning from lectures. Not that they learn that way these days, but you're not equipping the students for what they ought to do. And at a profound level, I think universities almost always, to some degree, get in the way through their processes of the fundamental goals of the educational experience. We don't have a choice. Society constructs these institutions. It has to occur because of our numbers in these institutions. But we have to fight it. So thinking long term, that's an important question. If it's about the outdoors, why isn't it outdoors?
Well, even when it's not about the outdoors, why isn't it outdoors?
Yeah. Well, that's true too. Yeah. Because of the bigger question of what kind of citizens, responsible inhabitants of the planet, do we want people to be? And raising people in protected, sort of cocoon-like settings, it's a big issue. I'm very sympathetic to the perspective. Yeah. Please, go ahead.
Hi, I'll just speak now because this is kind of related. I'm also an outdoor and experiential education student. I chose to come to Queen's because of this program. Its reputation precedes itself. I've been involved in outdoor education for 10 years, and everyone I've worked with and talked to speaks very highly of this program. So that's why I chose to come here. And as outdoor and experiential education students this year, we will be engaged in 120 hours of hands-on instructional time. So this has involved water skiing behind a canoe, making our own wooden utensils, and visiting several outdoor education centers, often facilitated by grads of this program. This 120 hours doesn't include the community building potlucks, the campouts, the workshops, the skill building and development, the networking, the conferences, and all the practice that we've done also on our own time and together. And despite the life-changing activities and reputation of OEE, it's now being offered as an online AQ course to be completed in just a few short months. The online format goes against the very idea of experiential education and against the intimate and progressive approach that established Queen's as a leader in outdoor education. Research shows that we need less screen time and more concrete experience. This is particularly true of our generation. We need more opportunities to put our phones down and to engage locally. This aligns with all of our mental health and wellness goals too as a university. Queen's has been a leader in outdoor education, and to keep this role, I think we need to invest in impactful formats. So the online course means that the face-to-face experiencing we're participating in will only show up as a course on our transcript, but we will not receive the qualification compared to those who participate in online, but it's called the same thing. So we're so proud of this program and feel so honored to have been a part of it. We would just like you to consider that there be some type of distinguishing difference between the online format and the program track in order to honor the very essence of outdoor and experience-based learning.
Thanks. So your dean is here, and I'm quite sure your dean is intimately familiar with these issues. And as I said, some of these decisions are made not because people want to make them, but sometimes because the circumstances just necessitate. There are budget challenges and all that kind of thing. But good point. I'm sure the faculty, if it can, will do its best to address that. That is an interesting question. If a course is offered in two radically different formats, is it the same course? And if it isn't, perhaps there's an important... Oh, please, Rebecca. There you go.
The AQ course is a course for after people have graduated. It is a course that's created through the Ontario College of Teachers. They're the ones who call it that, but it's actually a course that is for people who want to just look at outdoor education policies. Not the same course at all. We agree that it's confusing because of the name. We encourage you to write to the Ontario College of Teachers and request that they change the name of the AQ. We can't do it, but the Ontario College of Teachers can do it. And it's creating a lot of confusion. And it really is just an introduction for people to see outdoor education policies, not outdoor education. They're not qualified like you are to teach outdoor education. So write to the Ontario College of Teachers, please.
Thanks, Rebecca. Very helpful. Thank you. Yeah, please.
Me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carolyn.
Here's the mic.
Thank you. First of all, I just wanted to thank you for holding this. I think it's really important and nice to come and be able to kind of speak in a direct way. So my question is about the police investigation that's taking place into the Town Hall incident. Mm-hmm. So the racist and homophobic incident happened over 3 months ago now. And on October 10th, the university published in a statement to the Gazette that the Kingston Police Department had been notified and it was under active investigation. However, obviously significant time has passed and there hasn't been any updates. So my question is it still under investigation? And if so, when can we expect to hear more information?
Good question. So my understanding, so when these things are in the hands of the police, they're in the hands of the police. So my understanding is the investigation is active still. I can't tell you when we will hear from the police, because frankly, I mean, I have the same concerns you do. This is a long time for what ought to have been a fairly simple investigation. I mean, either there is no evidence that would enable the police to identify the perpetrator now, or there is, in which case you'd expect there'd be some conclusions reached. But, you know, it's not for me to second guess the police, but I mean, I take your point and we'll ask the police for an update so that we know at least where things stand.
Thank you.
Thanks. Other comments? Yeah, please.
Hello, my name is Danny, and just before I forget, I'm just gonna quickly apologize in advance because this is gonna sound like a rant. But I was just wondering if there was a way for the professors to be able to communicate beforehand before the courses start, because I feel like there were a lot of times during the school year where it just felt like there was a lot of overlap between the courses. So in terms of materials, I mean, so I personally didn't mind learning the same thing twice, but then after talking to a lot of my friends, they kind of felt like they were just kind of like the school is not really running as efficiently, and it could just be more effective, and they just felt like they're kind of being more behind than they would have been if they were to talk about something new rather than teaching the same thing. So just wondering if there was a way to make sure that they kind of coordinate and and kind of minimize the overlap in materials as much as they can.
You know, I'm so out of my depth with questions of this nature. So I almost want to ask the Dean again to comment on this. I don't want to put you on the spot, Rebecca, but it's a question of the day-to-day way in which courses are offered. So your Dean is best positioned to comment on it.
Is it on? Yeah. Okay. So your concern was that you hear the same thing over and over again?
Not well, I'm not saying for all the courses, but then like there were a few courses where it felt like I'm kind of hearing the same thing again.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, part of it is the way, well, there's two things. One is we encourage instructors to work together if they are teaching similar material. We can't make them, but we can ask them. But the other thing is, in education, you hear the same things over and over in a kind of spiral curriculum in different contexts. And rather than saying, oh, I've heard that before, we encourage students to say, okay, why am I hearing it here in this context? I heard it in my methods course. Why am I hearing it now in my equity course? What's different? And I would challenge you to ask your teacher, we did hear it this way in this course. Why are we hearing it this way in this particular one? Because the concepts and ideas may be familiar, but the context can change. And when you're teaching in school, I'm assuming you may teach in school, we talk about the spiral curriculum every year. Kids do reading and they learn more about reading and they deepen their understanding and they learn more. So it's not about, here are the 6 facts, you've got it, away you go. It's about taking these more complex constructs and ideas and working through them. And as you grow as a teacher and as you have experience in your practicum, you come back with a different attitude and you change. So as you grow, you also think about those ideas differently. So think about it as a measure of how you're growing and changing as a teacher, rather than, oh gosh, I heard that before. Okay? And I do admit, sometimes you may hear the same thing again, but mostly just pay attention and really see if that's true. Okay?
Thanks, Rebecca. Very helpful. Thanks. So I wanted to, if I may, we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left. I want to try lift our discussion to some of the, we've looked at some of the big questions around, what should be taught, what outcomes we want for students, and what kind of people we want them to be, and so on. Any suggestions for me or thoughts on big picture issues for the university as opposed to particular programmatic ones? Hey, Susie, yeah, go ahead.
Hello. So I had the probably not altogether unique, but somewhat unique experience of moving to Kingston before becoming a student. So I lived a year as a non-Queen's student and then as a Queen's student over successive years. And so one of the main issues for me that I'd like to see Queen's address is that relationship with the city of Kingston. And I was glad you mentioned that in the introduction. Because I could really feel as a non-Queen student versus being a Queen student, that difference was very stark in how you're treated in the community. And yeah, so I'd like to see an investigation into what needs to be mended, what relationships are broken between the community in Kingston, who might not even be employed by Queens, and everyone who's related to Queens. And yeah, just an investigation into what is going on in that relationship that makes it feel so separate.
Thanks for raising it. I mean, I think it is, again, as someone coming back, it's a big issue in the city. I'll just give you some random thoughts about it, but basically I would say to you, yes, this has to be a priority to work on a relationship with a city that is productive and constructive and supportive and so on. So absolutely we need to address that. We have a particular version of the classic university town problem here. In university towns, the whole issue of the size of the university relative to the size of the broader community is a big question. So there's some places, you might think of some place like Antigonish, Nova Scotia, right, where you've got a university in a very small town. There is not, you get a different kind of relationship, but not the same tension we have. We have, by Canadian standards, a middle to large size university in a relatively small community, and a relatively small and unchanging community, whereas the student population turns over all the time. So it's like we've got this sort of corrosive machine at the center of what is quite a conservative and a lovely city which is jealous of its beauty and the quality of life here. And so you tend to get friction in that kind of a setting more than you do at the U of T, for example. I mean, the U of T is huge, but it's in a city so large, these issues don't come up in the same way. I remember in Hamilton a slightly different version of this, not quite as acute, because the city is 400,000 people as opposed to 140,000, So so there is that fracture line that's always going to be problematic, right? And it begins with student behavior issues. It's a lot of students. I mean, in our community, in a prized residential part of the city. So that behavior becomes problematic, even when students are just being students and not being particularly egregious in their behavior. It can be a problem for the community. There are other things that happen too. I mean, universities do bring huge economic benefits to the cities in which they reside, but not every citizen sees that. And many citizens perceive universities to be a drain on assets in the city. You know, there's so many perspectives on this, but I think one of the most significant things about it is the number of narratives about that relationship and how it plays out. So I recently made an appearance at City Council shortly after the homecoming weekend. I was not warmly received. For reasons I perfectly understand, you know, citizens who don't wish to have their lives disrupted have a right not to have that happen. But so then the question is, what do you do about this? Student behavior is one thing. We've got all kinds of things. We've got codes of conduct. We have, you know, new strategies for dealing with homecoming and all of this all the time. But I want to go back to the point that was made earlier, I think in response to Robert's question. The most effective way to address the problem you've spoken about is to mobilize the university actively and obviously for the benefit of the community. If I stand up at City Hall and say, you know, our economic impact on the city of Kingston is $1.6 billion a year, it may be true, but it doesn't matter at all to the people whose lives are being disrupted. On the other hand, you know, if someone sees their elderly parent being helped out by some student volunteers, if students are active in the community doing work, if they're working on the natural resources of the city, making this a better place to live and be, slowly you do make progress. And if I were to say point to one area in which that problem you've spoken to could really be addressed, it would be for the university to deliberately and effectively declare a priority of actively seeking to improve the quality of life in this community through partnership with the community, not by saying, you know, we brought you these gifts, enjoy them, don't be ingrates. No, you have to actually be in a dialogue with the community. What do you want? This is a world-class university at the heart of a beautiful city, which has problems. It has, you know, a large part of the Canadian prison system in the city. So there are problems. We can be useful, and we need to actually be useful. And if we are useful, then I think that problem will never go away, because it's at least the town gown behavioral problem is never going to go away entirely, but it can be moderated, and people's perspective on the value that comes from having students in their midst can change. I hope that makes some sense. Yeah. So we'll do one more question. Kathy.
Thank you. I'm on. Again, I don't want to let this evening finish. It strikes me that a lot of what we're talking about here tonight is about the values that we want to espouse to a broader world, and what are the values that are important to us, and how we're going to live with them, and how we're going to make sure that our graduates graduate with those same values. And I'm struck by, I started a new job in September, and I've been working at the union office here at Queen's, and I'm struck by how disenfranchised Queen's staff feel right now. And I don't know what it is, and I haven't been able to figure it out, but I hear the same story over and over and over every day from different departments, but it's a disenfranchisement of Queen's staff. And I think that if we're looking at the values that we want to, you know, embrace as a university and as a community, that we have to make sure that we include our staff in that, because they are the backbone and they make this place work. And when we're not valuing them, we're really doing them a disservice. And I just wanted to make sure that that got on the record somewhere.
It needs to be on the record, because I completely agree with it. I mean, universities are wonderful. I mean, I've spent, I don't know what it is, 40 years working in them, for one good reason, and that's that it is possible in a university to achieve a kind of social dispensation that's almost impossible to achieve outside. And part of that is the collegiality of the place, the issue that was raised earlier, the serious responsiveness that there has to be to student thought about what's done in here. Staff are critically important. You know, these places are not just an academic faculty. They cannot function just as an academic faculty. They require all kinds of talent from all the different constituencies that work in them. I totally agree with you. And no one should be disenfranchised, because to the degree that there is disenfranchisement in the university, we will not achieve what we want to achieve. It's not a corporation. And everybody has to be pulling, and they have to be pulling with commitment and enjoyment and pleasure in the great goal of the institution. And I mean, I don't know about you, but the reason to work in a place like this is that I don't think there's a better mission in the world other than fostering the development of human beings to go out and do great stuff. And you can't do that if you're at each other's throats. You can't do it if you're not listening to each other. You can't do it if you're issuing orders rather than learning from each other. So let's keep that notion of what kind of community it should be. That's one reason, and I'll end with this. This is one reason why the Iranian plane crash, I mean, death is always awful in that kind of setting. But the death of students and educators and people connected to higher education is especially tragic. Because as I said a couple of times last week, this is about a good future. We're all about a good future. Human conflict is not about a good future. It's death dealing. So higher education is the hope against conflict. Education in general is the hope against conflict. That's why that was such an awful event, both in real human terms and symbolically for what it tells us. So thanks everybody for coming. I really value all the comments you've made, all the questions you've asked, and they have been recorded for posterity and my future use on video. And I hope you'll continue to contribute. So come out to other events, write to me, come see me, as Robert did. We had a great conversation. That will help us get to the point at which we can articulate a vision for the university that embraces the vision that Kathy was just hinting at there through her question, but also helps us address some of those big questions. I mean, you know, do we just say, this is a university that's going to say climate change is our issue? There's no bigger issue to address, so for the foreseeable future, that's where our energy is going. Why shouldn't we think about that? Yeah. So thanks, everybody. That's great. Thank you.